I now call to order the Society's 2,388th meeting in the 147th year since its founding in 1871. Good evening, everyone. My name is Larry Milstein. I'm the president of PSW, the oldest scientific society of Washington, D.C., committed to providing a forum to further scientific understanding and inquiry. Welcome to our members and guests to tonight's lecture by Chris Rollston in the John Wesley Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., including our members and friends around the world who are watching the live stream of tonight's meeting on PSW Science's YouTube channel. We'll begin with a few announcements and a reading of the minutes of the 2,387th meeting of the Society and Aviv Regev's lecture on the Human Cell Atlas. I will present a short summary of the proceedings of the 40th meeting of the Society in 1873, and then turn to this evening's lecture, which will be followed by a question and answer period. Thereafter, I will present a small thank you gift to our speaker, make a few closing announcements, and then adjourn the meeting to the social hour. Please join me in thanking the sponsors of the Fall 2017 and Spring 2018 lecture series, the Policy Studies Organization in cooperation with the American Public University, and a generous donor who has asked not to be named. I am pleased to announce that the following new members have been elected to the Society. Ned McCullough, an attorney and lobbyist interested in textiles and fashion technology, as well as biology, chemistry, and physics. Newton Campbell, a senior software engineer at AI Solutions, interested in machine learning, AI, computational physics, and cosmology. And Karen Dan, a returning member interested in middle school science education. And finally, tonight's speaker, Chris Rollston, whose interest will be apparent from tonight's lecture. Please join me in welcoming them to the Society. If any of our recently announced new members are here tonight and they have not yet picked up their signed reprint of Volume 1 of the PSW Bulletin, please see me after the lecture and I will be happy to give them the copy. James Thielen will now read the minutes of Aviv Regev's lecture at the 2,387th meeting earlier this month. James, the podium is yours.
President Larry Milstein called the 2,387th meeting of the Society to order. He announced the order of business, announced the evening's lecture would be live streamed on the internet, and welcomed new members. The minutes of the 2,386th meeting of the Society were then read and approved. President Milstein then recounted the 39th meeting of the Society, held in 1873, the details of which are summarized in the first volume of the PSW Bulletin. President Milstein then introduced the speaker for the evening, Aviv Regev, professor of biology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, core member and faculty chair at the Broad Institute, and an investigator at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Her lecture was titled, The Human Cell Atlas, Revolutionizing Our Understanding of Cellular Diversity and Dynamics. For the past 150 years, scientists have classified cells by their structures, functions, locations, and more recently, molecular profiles. But the characterization of cell types and states, however, has remained limited. Fortunately, an opportunity is emerging due to advances in experimental and computational methods that are changing our understanding of cell type and state characterization. Scientists long lacked understanding of how it is that we have one genome which produces so many cell types. But through technological advances, scientists have learned that different cells select which parts of their DNA are transcribed to RNA, and which strands of RNA are translated into proteins, at which level, and how stable those proteins will be. This understanding explains the qualitative and quantitative differences between our cells. It also allows us to identify genetic variants that cause different diseases. Regev said, understanding cells' gene expression provides us with a unified set of coordinates by which every gene is an axis in every cell is a point in a high-dimensional space. The position of a cell in this space is its expression profile. Cells with similar expression profiles will be near each other. Unfortunately, the reality is, while we can measure the expression of every RNA in a cell, we cannot measure the expression of every protein. Moreover, until recently, we've only been able to measure averages of these expressions. Fortunately, technological advances have allowed us to measure individual cell expression. The first major advance was single-cell genomics, which allows us to capture an individual cell, capture the RNA of that cell, transcribe it to DNA, and to sequence that DNA. In the last 10 years, scientists have gone from sequencing dozens of individual cells at once to sequencing millions at a time. The second major advance was spatial genomics, which has allowed scientists to observe things in situ within individual cell tissue. As yet, this technique works on only dozens of cells at a time. These advances have led the scientific community to launch the Human Cell Atlas, or HCA, an international collaborative consortium that aims to leverage scale to create a comprehensive reference map of the types and properties of all human cells as a basis for understanding, diagnosing, monitoring, and treating health and disease. The HCA sees itself as similar to the Human Genome Project, but tackling a more complex task. Whereas the Human Genome Project mapped the human genome with concerns about variations between people, the HCA seeks to map cells, which are different not only between people, but with time, activity, and other conditions within any individual person. The comprehensive map that HCA seeks to produce may be described as a Google Maps for the human body. In the bounds of its first draft, HCA has identified 30 to 100 million cells, estimating that we'll have identified more than 10 billion unique cells when finished. Regev expects the HCA will teach us fundamental biology about taxonomy, histology, developmental biology, and physiology of human cells. Ultimately, Regev believes the HCA will ultimately lead to a new era of precision medicine. President Milstein then invited questions from the audience. One guest asked why the HCA uses open source software as opposed to free software. Regev clarified that while open source, HCA's software is under an MIT BSD license, which she says is a good, non-contaminating approach. Another guest asked how HCA intends to obtain its tissue samples and whether it intends to take samples from the same donors over time. Regev said that biopsies are helpful. They're fresh, but they are too small and too random to develop maps of full organs. Post-mortem and transplant donors, while not as fresh as biopsies, however, allow for full organ sampling. After the question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speaker, made the usual housekeeping announcements, and invited guests to join the society. President Milstein then adjourned the 2,387th meeting of the society to the social hour. Temperature, 3.3 C. Weather, clear. Attendance, 120. Respectfully submitted, James Heelan, Recording Secretary.
Thank you, James. Are there any comments, corrections, additions to the minutes? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion from a member to accept the minutes as read. A second. All members in favor? All members opposed? Minutes are accepted as read and will be posted to the website in due course. The 40th meeting of the Society was held on Saturday, 1 February 1873, almost exactly 145 years ago. President Joseph Henry was in the chair presiding. As many of you know by now, Joseph Henry was a primary founder of PSW and its longest-serving president, leading the organization from 1871 until his death in 1878. He was the preeminent American physicist of his time, known internationally for his pioneering work on electricity and magnetism, particularly his work on electromagnetic induction, work that led to the invention of the telegraph and the telephone, in which he played a part. Among other important roles, Henry served as the founding and first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Henry died unexpectedly on 13 May 1878, which was declared a day of national mourning. They had a lot of respect for physicists back then. He's buried in Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown, and there is a well-known statue of Henry in front of the Smithsonian Castle, in which building this society was founded. John Philip Sousa wrote the Transit of Venus March, which you heard at the beginning, for the unveiling of the statue of Joseph Henry that is now in front of the Smithsonian Institution. At that meeting, Benjamin Alvord made a presentation on the habitability of the elevated plateaus of the West. Alvord was a West Point graduate, served in the Seminole Wars, the Mexican-American War, and in the Civil War on garrison duty at Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory. He was interested in facilitating the westward migration of immigrants to the United States by publicizing information about the Western territories based on his own explorations and those of others. He was something of an amateur mathematician as well, and shared with Apollonius an interest in finding ways to determine a circle tangent to three given circles. Benjamin Peirce made a presentation on theories of the nature of comets. Theories on the nature of comets' tails, summarizing a communication previously made to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The paper is still available in volume 120 of the Astronomical Journal. Peirce, and it really is pronounced Peirce, was a major figure in American science, particularly mathematics and astronomy. He was particularly recognized in his day for developing linear association algebra, summarized in the posthumous publication of his monograph, pictured in this slide. It's interesting to note that money then, as well as now, was a factor in what could and could not be done in science, as in all things, and that one of Peirce's talents was raising money. At that time, astronomical observations at Harvard were severely limited by time and equipment. However, in March 1843, a comet of surpassing size and splendor appeared, generating enormous public interest in astronomy, which Peirce used to advantage by pointing out the deficiencies in Harvard's facilities and initiating a public appeal for funds to improve them. He was so successful in this early form of crowdsourcing that he raised sufficient funds to build a truly first-class observatory. Gifts ranging from $10 to $5,000, totaling $25,730 was raised, and the money was used to commission a 15-inch diameter lens from Mertz and Mailer and to construct the Harvard Great Refractor, which for 20 years was among the largest telescopes in the world and certainly the largest and best telescope in the United States. Peirce's children followed in his footsteps and became important figures in their own right in American science. Perhaps chief among them was Charles Sanders Peirce, among other things, a very important American philosopher, founder of pragmatism and semiotics. Both Peirce the elder and his son Charles were members of PSW. Finally, at that meeting, E.B. Elliott reported on life and annuity tables based on the 1870 census. Ezekiel Brown Elliott was an inventor, mathematician, and actuary. He worked for the New England Mutual Life Insurance Company and prepared tables of survivorships, which contained over 18,000 logarithmic values. Remember, there were no calculators or computers in those days, so we're talking a lot of hand calculations. During the Civil War, he served on the Sanitary Commission, which was a very important commission for the protection of soldiers from disease. And because of that work, he was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He then worked for the U.S. Revenue Commission on untangling the chaos of customs duties and internal revenue taxes that had been imposed during the Civil War. He also prepared papers on the 1870 census, in particular on mortality rates by occupation. The paper he presented to the Society was also based upon the 1870 census. And we now turn from the 40th meeting in 1873 to tonight's lecture on cultural heritage and modern inscriptional forgeries in the marketplace. And it's my pleasure to introduce, with a few brief words, tonight's speaker, Christopher Rollston. Chris is professor of Northwest Semitic languages and literatures in the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the George Washington University. Previously, he was a faculty member in Near Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University, visiting professor of Northwest Semitic languages at Tel Aviv University, National Endowment Scholar at the American Center of Oriental Research in Amman, Jordan, and Toyozo Nakari Professor at the Emmanuel School of Religion. Chris works in more than a dozen ancient and modern languages, including, but remarkably not limited to, Hebrew, Phoenician, Aramaic, Palmyrean, Ammonite, Moabite, Edomite, Ugaritic, Akkadian, Hellenistic Greece, Classical Latin, Sahidic, Coptic, and modern German, French, Spanish, and Italian. Fortunately, he also speaks English. He has conducted research throughout the world at museums and departments of antiquity in Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Europe, and throughout North America and Europe. And he has undertaken excavations at El Mara in Syria and Megiddo in Israel. Chris has authored numerous scholarly articles and books. He's published widely in the popular press and frequently appears in the media. He earned his MA and PhD at Johns Hopkins University in Ancient Northwest Semitic Languages and Literatures. Please hold questions for the question and answer period at the end of the lecture, and join me in welcoming Chris to the podium.
It's a pleasure to be here this evening in your midst for this session of the Philosophical Society of Washington. I'm very grateful to President Larry Milstein for the invitation to be here, and I'm very grateful for the presence of my professional and professorial colleagues, Eric Klein and Shana Marshall. I'm going to lecture tonight about epigraphic forgeries during the course of recent decades, or really within the past couple of centuries. It's a field that I've discussed from time to time during the past 15 years approximately. One of the things that's true is that disproving authenticity is not that difficult. Proving authenticity is almost impossible at times. I should preface this statement by noting this. In essence, during the past century and a half or 2 centuries, excavations have occurred in the Middle East, and inscriptions, as well as various other archaeological artifacts and architecture, have been found. However, at times, clandestine digs have occurred at various places within the Middle East, within the Middle East, and these pieces often surface on the antiquities market. So that's a fact. So in essence, we have excavations occurring, and much is found in those excavations. Official excavations, scientific excavations, but we also have clandestine digging that's not legal, not permissible, but things are found, and those things appear on the antiquities market, and they're sold, and they end up in various sorts of collections. That's a fact as well. One of the other things, and it will be the primary focus of the lecture tonight, is the fact that because inscriptions sell for so much money on the antiquities market, the problem that's arisen during the past 100, 150 years is the fact that often people will forge inscriptions and then sell them as if they were ancient. Some of these will be rather famous, and I'll reference some of those in a few minutes. The Yaakov ossuary, for example, the James ossuary, as it's also referred to, is certainly one of the most famous. The Jehoash inscription, which I'll also refer to and discuss, is also one of the most famous. The so-called Jesus wife papyrus is something that's garnered attention during the past few years. The Jerusalem papyrus is another piece. All of those pieces have appeared in the antiquities market, and those who owned them, sold them, purchased them, argued that they were in fact ancient pieces. Ultimately, all of those are modern forgeries, and a few years ago, after publishing some on this subject, about a decade and a half ago, really now, I ended up testifying in an Israeli courtroom in East Jerusalem about some of these pieces that I contended were forgeries. I wasn't alone. There were a fair number of people who argued as well that they were forgeries. In any case, that's in essence a background of tonight's subject matter. The Yaakov ossuary, and I call it the Yaakov ossuary rather than the James ossuary, although it's certainly known in most circles as the James ossuary. I consider that terminology to actually be prejudicial. That is to say, to call it the James ossuary conjures up a notion of the brother of Yeshua, that is to say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he is referred to within the New Testament, in English translations at least, as the New Testament, as James. Yet ultimately, the word here on this ossuary, and I'll show it to you here now, it is Yaakov. It's not James. And so we have this piece here. It's an inscription that surfaced on the antiquities market during the first year or two of the 2000s, about 2001, 2002, it surfaced on the antiquities market, and it went over to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto for a major exhibit there. It was valued ostensibly at some $2 million. Without this inscription, the value of this ossuary, and ossuary was of course a bone box in essence. Bones were placed there after the flesh had deteriorated. Ossuaries are usually about 3 feet in width, about 24 inches in height, and about 18 to 24 inches in depth. And that's the case with this one as well. They would sell for a few hundred or a few $1,000s. But because this inscription purports to, or it has, this ossuary has an inscription on it, which in essence reads, Yaakov bar Yosef, or Jacob the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus, it was valued at a great deal, a few $1 million. And I want to draw your attention to something right away. The French epigrapher André Lemaire, who published this, argued that it was absolutely authentic. That is to say, he argued that not only was the ossuary authentic, which it certainly is, the ossuary itself, the bone box carved out of stone is certainly authentic. He argued that the inscription, the entire inscription, was actually authentic as well. I believe, and I've argued, that in essence, the part that says Yaakov bar Yosef, Jacob the son of Joseph, or James the son of Joseph, is indeed authentic, but the part that says Ahui de Yeshua, the brother of Jesus, is a modern forgery. And in fact, if you look at this inscription, you can see a fairly strong difference between this portion, the portion that says Yaakov bar Yosef, and this portion which says Ahui de Yeshua. One doesn't need to be a paleographer to discern the difference. There's a difference in terms of the depth of the incisions, the clarity, the presence of something called kerning, in essence, ticks in the letters. This is a fine example of an inscription that is in part authentic, but in part a modern forgery. So it's one of the most famous pieces in this discussion. But this wasn't the first modern forgery, that is to say the Yaakov ossuary, the James ossuary, appearing during the early years of the 2000s. Forgeries have been produced in the field of Northwest Semitic and the field of Greek and Roman studies as well for a very long time. During the late 1860s, there was a very fine inscription, this inscription. It's the Mesha Stela, dates to the 9th century BCE. Very fine inscription, written in the Moabite language, written in the Old Hebrew script. It mentions figures known from the ancient Near East, including the Hebrew Bible, such as Omri, king of Israel. Very fascinating inscription and certainly authentic. However, not long after the appearance of, or the discovery of, the Mesha stela, these sorts of pieces, as you see here, and this is me looking at one of them in the basement of the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, started to appear in the antiquities market. And in fact, not just in inscriptions of small numbers, but literally scores of these pieces, even hundreds, and indeed a few thousand of these pieces. They're really quite beautiful in their own right. This is clay. Some of them are pottery, such as this one. Some of them are actually on stone. They have letters that are very similar to the letters of the Mesha inscription, but they're really quite poor in many ways. But they did actually fool a large number of people in the 1870s. In fact, there was a very famous German scholar who was best known for his work in Ethiopic, who argued, his name was Schlottmann, and he argued until his death that all of these were actually authentic pieces from the Iron Age, that is to say, pieces from circa the 8th century BCE, the 9th century BCE. Nevertheless, this is a very clear modern forgery. And scholars such as Claremont Ganneau argued that and persuaded ultimately most people in the field even then. So the point that I'm making here is the James ossuary, or the Yaakov ossuary, is one of the most famous recent modern forgeries. But this process, or this phenomenon of people producing forgeries and then selling them on the antiquities market, is something that's been around for literally a century and a half, and indeed even longer than that. These pieces here were sold by Shapira in Jerusalem, and he sold them throughout the world. He sold them to the French government, to the German government, to the British government. This is another example, therefore, of an early forgery. One of the most fascinating forgeries that came out in the wake of the Shapira forgeries was the Brazilian Phoenician inscription. This inscription purported to have been found, or people purported that this had been found off the coast of Brazil, or rather near the coast of Brazil, inland, but near the sea. And the argument was that this inscription was a Phoenician inscription. It actually references Hiram. You see a drawing of it here. It references Hiram, and many people argued that in essence what we have here is a Phoenician inscription that was made by Phoenician sailors who had left the Phoenician homeland but were blown severely off course, ended up in Brazil, and ultimately made this inscription recounting their ordeal on the seas. And although that may sound to us to be deeply suspicious and problematic, there were people who actually embraced this as an authentic piece. Schlottmann, fascinating as it may be, the very scholar who had authenticated the Shapira forgeries, saw this, and even he said that this was a modern forgery. It was dismissed by people such as Mark Lidzbarski as an obvious forgery. Fascinating, though, Cyrus Gordon, during the 1960s, wrote an article about this very piece and argued that it was authentic. Frank Cross of Harvard rapidly wrote another article and said, no, Cyrus Gordon, this is certainly not an authentic piece. The point that I'm making here is that with regard to the subject of modern forgeries, this isn't simply a phenomenon of the past decade or two. It's been something that's been around for a very long time. And indeed, one could go back even much further in the field and find additional examples. This is something that, this is an inscription. These are the Philistine Hebron inscriptions. These surfaced in the very late 1960s, and These inscriptions purport to have been Philistine inscriptions. The story that was attached to them at the time that they surfaced on the antiquities market was that they came from the city of Hebron. There was a very fine scholar from the University of Michigan whose name was George Mendenhall. He argued that these were indeed ancient inscriptions, precious inscriptions, written on vellum, and would really revolutionize the field of biblical studies. Frank Cross was in the audience. Frank Cross of Harvard was in the audience at the time that Mendenhall of Michigan announced this great find. And Mendenhall and Cross had both done PhDs at Johns Hopkins University, and they were rivals of sorts. In any case, Frank Cross declared immediately that this was a forgery. And Mendenhall was very disturbed at Cross and said so in an article or two. Nonetheless, Cross didn't even bother writing an article about them. But Mendenhall continued to argue that these were authentic even throughout the 1970s. Finally, Joseph Navev, Hebrew University, in the early 1980s, decided that he'd write an article about these. He did, and he actually noted in the article that this is, in essence, this forgery was a modern forgery, to be sure. It was almost a vitz, as it were, a joke, because one of the most famous Old Hebrew inscriptions is the Siloam Tunnel inscription. This inscription has basically the same text as that very famous and authentic 8th century Old Hebrew inscription, the Siloam Tunnel inscription, but this has it written backwards. It's very embarrassing for Mendenhall, I'm sure. He never really said, after Navez's article, much about that piece. The point is that we have a lot of these that are surfacing. This is one of the most famous. It's the ivory pomegranate. It was purchased by the Israel Museum through the generous donation of an anonymous donor. And the price that the Israel Museum paid for the ivory pomegranate, you see here me looking at it, under a microscope at the Israel Museum, was a mere $550,000. Remember, this is the late 1970s, early 1980s, and so $550,000 was more money than it might seem to be today. It's an enormous sum. In any case, this was on display at the Israel Museum for a very long time, and it was really one of the most famous pieces at the Israel Museum. Ultimately, André Lemire, the same scholar who published the James Ossuary as authentic, also published the ivory pomegranate as authentic, and the consensus of scholarship on the basis of a fair amount of paleographic data is that the ivory pomegranate is a modern forgery as well. The pomegranate itself is ancient, probably late Bronze Age, but no one's done a C14 test on it. But the inscription is certainly a modern forgery, just as was the case with the Yaakov or James ossuary as well. The point that I want to make here is there's a great deal of money. So there are many reasons for the production of forgeries during the past 150 or 200 years. Money is certainly, that is to say, venality is certainly one of the motives that's part of the equation. This is an inscription that was published in the late 1980s. It's the Musayef Astrakhan. And I want to draw your attention to certain facets of it. I don't know that you can see it very well, but I think you might be able to see it just well enough. This inscription was published by some very fine scholars, one from the University of Chicago. And it was published as a really sterling, impressive piece, really a sine qua non in a lot of ways. There's a lot that I could say about this, including the way in which this very inscription entered into the discussion of my dissertation on the day that I defended. But I'll spare that story. If you have some question about it, perhaps we can discuss it during the Q&A. In any case, this inscription is really quite fascinating. Those who produced the editio princeps of it, that is to say the first edition of it, argued, I guess I should say in the 1990s, late 1990s, argued that it was an inscription dating to the Iron Age. They discussed a possible 8th century date, a possible 7th century date, a possible early 6th century date. For this inscription, $125,000 was paid. So not as much as the ivory pomegranate, but a fairly substantial sum nonetheless. I want to draw your attention here to one of the words. This is the word kesef right here. And I want you to note in particular the relative height of that samach and that pay. Keep that in mind, because it was actually one of the bases for my argument that this piece as well was a modern forgery. In essence, notice that if you were to draw a line across the top, and remember that in ancient Hebrew inscriptions, they were, as in the case with Phoenician as well, Moabite, Ammonite, they were not written on a line, but rather hung from a line. And notice that in this case, that line, sometimes it's actually literally chiseled into stone, sometimes it's written in ink, sometimes it's not written, but it's in the mind of the scribe to be sure. That's actually, those letters are all penned at about the same height on the line. In any case, a very fascinating piece called the Musaif Ostracon. Here's my drawing of it. You can perhaps see here better the relative heights of those letters. Keep it in mind. We're going to come back to that inscription in just a moment. This is the Tel Dan inscription, certainly an authentic inscription found by Avraham Biran at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel. It's Aramaic. It dates to the 9th century BCE. It was commissioned arguably by Hazael, king of Damascus, that is to say of Syria. Very fine inscription. It mentions, although the context is broken to some degree, it mentions Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah, both of whom the author of this inscription claims to have assassinated. That dovetails fairly well with the narrative that we have in the book of Kings with regard to the death of those two kings. However, in the book of Kings, it's stated that Jehu of Israel, also a usurper, just as was Hazael, was the assassin. But one of the fascinating aspects is that it's clear from the biblical text that Hazael and Jehu had a coalition between the two of them. And so this inscription, a genuine inscription, conveys the fact that Hazael was the assassin of Jehoram and Ahaziah. The Bible mentions that Jehu is the assassin of those two, but because Hazael and Jehu were in an alliance, in essence, we don't have too much of a tension between those two. The point here is that we have this really fine inscription, 1993 and 94, the dates for the find of this. This portion was found in 93. These two portions were found in 94. There's a fairly decent join between the two of those. As is often the case with great finds of inscriptions, genuine inscriptions, in the wake of those finds, often forgeries are produced. Remember with me that in the wake of the discovery of the Mesha stela in the late 1860s, we have a few years, just a very few years after that, we have the Moabite forgeries produced as well, the Shapira forgeries. So also, with regard to the Tel Dan inscription, just a few short years after the discovery of the Tel Dan inscription, a very fine inscription, during 1993 and 94, we have this inscription surfacing on the antiquities market. This is a fascinating piece as well. Yes, I have a drawing of it, and I'll turn to that in just a minute. This inscription purports to come from the 9th century BCE as well, just as the Tel Dan inscription did. And I argued very rapidly the first time that I saw it that this was a very bad forgery. And one of the scholars, now late scholars, Joseph Nava of Hebrew University, who was arguably the best scholar of epigraphy in terms of someone who was able to discern a forgery, I immediately penned an email after seeing, or wrote an email after seeing this inscription the first time. I sent it to Nava, and I said, I've just seen a photo of this, and I'm quite sure it's a modern forgery. He wrote back within a few minutes, and he said, you're absolutely right. He said, I saw it. It was offered to the Israel Museum. He didn't tell me the price, but I later learned that it was offered to the Israel Museum for the tidy sum of $4 million. He told me that he told them not to purchase this piece, that it was definitively a more modern forgery. And I wrote an article about that as well, and Nava cited it or referenced it very approvingly. In any case, the point here is we have a lot of these forgeries that are surfacing. I want to draw your attention a moment to this phenomenon here. Again, I know that some of you will read Hebrew, probably not the old Hebrew script. This is in essence, it's a form of the old Hebrew script, not a very good form. The forger was not bad at the script, but really wasn't particularly good either. In any case, I want to draw your attention to these three letters again. That's the word kesef again. Notice the Samic and the pei and the relative height. Pei is just a little bit lower than the Samic. This is the Baruch Bull. You've perhaps heard of this as well. It was published in Bar, Biblical Archaeology Review. The article was, or at least there was an article in Bar about this piece, and it was said to have the fingerprints of Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah. And so, in essence, the suggestion was that we have the fingerprints of someone who's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, closely connected with the prophet Jeremiah. An amazing piece. It's about the size. This bull is about the size of your thumbnail. And it actually says, belonging to Baruch Yahu, Ben, the son of Neriyahu, Hasofer, the scribe. So, belonging to Baruch, the son of Neriah, the scribe. It seemed like an amazing find. It seemed to be something that dovetailed with the biblical record rather nicely. And Avigad published this piece. He absolutely believed it was authentic, though it appeared in the antiquities market, as did the James Ossuary, as did the Jehoash inscription, as did the Brazilian Phoenician inscription, and yet it was lauded as a really stunning piece. It became really very famous very rapidly. You see another slide of it here. So I'm asking you to do a little bit of paleography. This may be your first venture into paleography, but I believe that you'll do it rather well. In any case, notice here again the Samic and the pei and the resh. This is the word sofer, the word for scribe, all in sequence there and all about the same height. This is another piece. It's also from the antiquities market. Notice the Samic pei combination there, and they're at about the same level. The reason I focused on the Samic pei is this. If you look at this inscription, which is a real inscription discovered at the site of Lachish, not too far away from the city of Jerusalem, during the early years of the 20th century, the early decades of the 20th century, here's a Samic as well, and there's a pei as well. Can anybody notice any difference between this and those pieces from the market that I've shown you so far? Anything that strikes you as being different? The stance is really quite different. Now, I should mention this. When paleographers historically have produced script charts, they actually will just write the letters in a straight line one after the other. One of the things that paleographers traditionally haven't done is to show the relative positioning of letters. The fascinating thing is the forger produced with inscriptions such as the Jehoash inscription, or the Musayef Ostracan, or the Baruch Bull. There are a pair of them. The letters were fine in terms of the morphology. That is to say, the shapes of the letters were fine, but the thing that the forger made a mistake with was the relative positioning of the Samic and the pei when they're in that sequence. So what I did, actually, was Naveh who suggested this first to me, to look for Samic and pei in sequence in all Hebrew inscriptions. So I did it. With every single Hebrew inscription from the Iron Age, I looked for the Samic pei in sequence, and lo and behold, in all cases, it's like that. Doesn't matter whether it's ink on pottery or chiseled into stone, the Samic, when it precedes a pei, always towers over the pei. So look here, you have a Samic as well in the pei, here as well. The pei is tucked nicely under the bottom horizontal bar of the Samic. This was one of the pieces, one of the main pieces that I used, but there were a constellation of these sorts of problems in those inscriptions from the market that made it possible for me to contend that these are, in fact, modern forgeries. So the point here is, just so that we don't lose the forest for the trees, we have a lot of really fine, genuine inscriptions coming from excavations in the Middle East, from Israel, from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon. We have wonderful inscriptions coming from the Levant, as well as various other parts of the Middle East as well. Coming from scientific excavations. That's wonderful. Those are good. We also have inscriptions that are ancient and authentic, but they've been pillaged. In other words, people dig them clandestinely, illicitly, and those appear on the antiquities market. That's something that occurs as well. The other thing that's also occurring, because inscriptions bring so much money, is that some very enterprising forgers have started to attempt to forge inscriptions and sell them on the antiquities market, at times for massive amounts of money. And that's a problem for a number of reasons, and I'll talk about some of the problems connected with that phenomenon in a few minutes. Many of them are discernible and deducible, some of them are not. This is something that surfaced a couple of years ago on the antiquities market. It was presented, in 2016 in Jerusalem in the month of October. It garnered international attention. In fact, Benjamin Netanyahu even mentioned this papyrus in a discussion of his with the press. It was considered quite famous because it mentioned the city of Jerusalem. The script is the old Hebrew script, and it was announced to a great deal of fanfare. And I wasn't at that symposium, but I saw a picture of it right before it was presented at that symposium. And I rapidly penned a blog post and said everybody was purporting or arguing that this piece was amazing, it was authentic. In essence, what it says, the beginning of it isn't preserved, as you can see, but it's a piece of ancient papyrus, quite nice. In many ways, it may look scrappy, but it's really quite nice. In any case, what it mentions is Melek the King. So it's written in the old Hebrew script. Here we have the word Jerusalem, so that's rather fascinating. You have a city name here, Na'arta. You also have the word Nevolim, which is a word for jars, and you have Yayin, the word for wine, right after it. So in essence, within this very brief inscription, you have reference to the city of Jerusalem, which we only have in one other inscription from an excavation. So Jerusalem, as striking as it may seem, isn't a place name that's referred to very often at all in Old Hebrew inscriptions. We just have one other inscription we have one inscription from an excavation that mentions Jerusalem. That's it. So when this inscription surfaced and it mentioned Melek the King, and it was written in Old Hebrew, script and language, and it mentioned Jerusalem, it garnered an awful lot of attention for all sorts of reasons. In any case, one of the things that I noted is that they had done a carbon-14 test on the papyrus. That's fascinating, but think about it. It's not actually all that useful. That is to say, it's possible for someone to purchase today. In fact, within a week, you could actually have your own piece of papyrus sitting in your mailbox. It's not that hard to find a blank piece of papyrus. And so when they did the carbon-14 test, the Israel Antiquities Authority did a carbon-14 test on this, it came back and it suggested something between, in essence, 800 BCE and 300 BCE, and people argued on the basis of the carbon-14 test that this must indeed be an ancient inscription. The problem with that is that dating the medium means virtually nothing about the time period of the writing of this. That is to say, it's possible for someone to purchase a piece of papyrus now, write an inscription on it. Lots of people know the Old Hebrew script. Lots of people know the Old Hebrew language. And so it's not that hard to actually find a piece of papyrus and pen something very carefully on it and sell it for astronomical amounts of money. And it happens. And it's not all that difficult. So one of the things that I noted is that the carbon-14 test that was done isn't decisive at all, because one can actually write on a piece of ancient papyrus an inscription in the modern period. It's just not that difficult at all. The one thing that wasn't done is the ink. And you may be thinking, couldn't one do a scanning electron microscope test of the chemical composition of the ink? One could absolutely do that. It wasn't done in this case. But it's not even that hard to fake ink in the modern period. So this piece appeared in the antiquities market. I actually saw it before it was announced, a couple of years before it was announced, before the Israeli authorities had actually seized it from a dealer. In any case, the ink isn't hard to fake either. All you have to do if you want to make ink, good ink that would pass a scanning electron microscope test of the chemical composition, is simply find a carbonized piece of a beam. You could go to just about any excavation occurring in the Levant today. You can find carbonized remains of beams, and if you took a little bit of that, you can actually make your own ink quite readily. Because inks were made out of they were made out of carbon. People would take, in antiquity, a scribe would take a little bit of a carbonized beam, and that would be the major constituent component of ancient ink. That's the way that it was done. A modern forger, a savvy one, you don't even have to be that savvy, can easily go to an excavation. I've bagged and tagged a lot of carbon through the years. Professor Klein's bagged and tagged enormous amounts more than I have ever dreamed of. In any case, it's not so hard to do that sort of thing. And if a forger wants to do that, he or she could actually take a piece of ancient papyrus, find some carbonized remains of a beam, make some ink that would actually pass a carbon-14 test, and also have the right chemical composition. In any case, with regard to this piece, the main point is the papyrus is certainly ancient, but that doesn't mean that the writing is ancient. The writing is actually modern, I've argued, in print. And no test of the ink was done on this piece, but even if it had been, I'm quite confident that it would actually come back as looking to be or appearing to be something that was ancient, based on the fact that any forger worth his or her salt would actually know to use carbonized remains today. So the point is that we have inscriptions appearing in the market that are certainly genuine, but we also have inscriptions appearing in the market that are modern forgeries. There's actually a really fascinating mistake in this one. It's a Hebrew grammatical mistake that's basically a howler. There's a problem with the construct form, which is an aspect of the Semitic languages. There are particular ways that construct forms always pattern. And one of the things that I've noted initially, not long after seeing that, was the fact that there's an error in the construct form, and it's not the error any ancient Israelite scribe would have ever made. Only someone who was not so great at ancient Hebrew would have made this mistake. It's not a mistake that would have been made in antiquity, but only a mistake, an orthographic mistake that would have been made in the modern period. This is a more famous piece as well, the Jesus Wife Papyrus. This inscription is written in Coptic, and it garnered a great deal of attention. This was published by Karen King of Harvard. It was published in HTR, Harvard Theological Review. A fascinating piece, and one of the things that is fascinating about it is the inscription actually purports to reference or to have Jesus referring to Jesus of Nazareth, referring to his wife. Now that's striking because in the New Testament Gospels, we certainly have no reference to Jesus of Nazareth being married. This inscription looks like, and Karen King argued that it came from the 6th century CE, that is to say, several centuries after the rise of Christianity. It's written in Coptic, not Greek. In any case, what she argued is that this is a really fascinating piece. She argued that it hails from the 6th century or 7th century CE, and it has to do, or it hailed from a segment of Christianity that believed that Jesus of Nazareth was married. One of the fascinating things about this is they did test the papyrus. It came back. Some of the carbon-14 tests came back as ancient. Some of them came back as old, but not in fact from antiquity. They also did tests of the ink, and the ink came back as being consistent with ancient inks. And for Karen King, that was enough for her to conclude the contents, the date, the carbon dating of the papyrus, the fact that the ink came back as consistent with ancient inks. That was enough for her to argue that, in fact, this was a piece that hailed from about the 6th century CE, a really fascinating piece, suggesting that there were segments of early Christianity, at least by the 6th or 7th century, that believed that Jesus actually had a wife. It's fascinating to see that. Ultimately, many people suggested that this really looked bad. In fact, the first time I saw it was the fall of 2012, and I learned Coptic when I was at Johns Hopkins, and I work a fair amount with inscriptions. And this looked to me much like the Jehoash inscription sort of struck me as a kinderspiel. The first time I looked at this, I thought, yeah, this really doesn't look very good. I suspect Karen King would have profited from a trip to the University of Michigan where they have some very fine papyrologists, and they would have told her this piece is bad. In any case, she argued in print that it was good. Then a very fine investigative journalist named Ariel Sabar actually began to investigate this. He ultimately talked to the owner, and the owner had told Karen King that he'd given her this story about the finding of this manuscript and how he'd come into acquisition of it, or how he'd acquired it. And she believed it ultimately, and ultimately Ariel Sabar made it very clear during the course of his investigative reporting that in fact it's a modern forgery, and arguably the owner who allowed Karen King to publish it was the very person who had actually forged it himself. So a very fascinating piece. I should mention, by the way, that the forger of this piece was someone who had basically washed out of a program in Coptic studies. That's actually a fairly common sort of phenomenon, I think. This is one of the most fascinating stories. It's also sort of instructive, I think, as well, with regard to the subject of modern forgeries, or forgeries in the modern period. A number of years ago, there was a very fine article, as it were, that was written by Coleman Norton about a piece that he said that he had seen in North Africa during WW2 when he was working there for the intelligence services. And he said that he wasn't able to bring it out or even to get a photograph of it, but he made a hand copy of it. And it was a fascinating piece. It was actually the Latin imperfectum in Matthew, and he argued that it was really scintillating, very important for the field of New Testament studies. He first sent it to Harvard to have it published. He was a Princeton professor. He sent it to Harvard to have it published, and ultimately they rejected it. He sent it to the University of Chicago to be published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. They rejected it as well, no doubt much to his chagrin. He then sent it to Catholic Biblical Quarterly, and it was published there. And then a decade or two after it was published, his own, Coleman Norton's own Dr. Zone, Bruce Metzger, who taught at Princeton for many years, basically outed him and said, this is a modern forgery. The point, and the reason why I wanted to show this inscription is this. You may be asking yourself, who is it that would do these forgeries, and what would the motives be? We'll talk about the motives in just a moment, but one of the most fascinating things that one often hears from people who think that all of these pieces are authentic is this. I'll often, and I've heard it, I've seen it in print, and I've argued against it, but oftentimes you'll hear people say this: no one with the ability to forge such an inscription would do it. I think that's a really fascinating, sweet, naive view of scholars and those connected with the field of epigraphy. That is to say, I wish that that were true. But the case of Coleman Norton is instructive in that regard. He was a Princeton professor, and he published a forgery. The fascinating thing is that he entitled the article an amusing agraphon. Agraphon is a Greek word which means not written. And with his very title, he was signifying, it seems, and Metzger argued this and noted as well, that this was actually something that he concocted in his own mind. It was an agraphon. It wasn't something that was ever written. So within the field of Northwest Semitic, Greek and Roman studies, we have a lot of forgeries. And that's a fact. We have a lot of inscriptions appearing in the antiquities market that are ancient inscriptions. There's no doubt about that. But we also have a lot of inscriptions that are appearing on the market that are modern forgeries. And that's a problem. One of the problems is, well, let me sort of move along. I think that I've got a section here. I don't want to go too long. Let's go to this section for just a moment. Some of the motives, I think, are probably fairly clear with regard to the motives for the production of forgery. There could be sour grapes, and I think this is arguably the case with the so-called Jesus wife papyrus. The person who forged that was someone who'd been washed out of a program in Egyptology, in particular someone who'd been washed out of a program of Coptic studies. He produced the forgery and no doubt was delighted to find that it was embraced by a Harvard scholar as being authentic. Now, he wasn't washed out of the program at Harvard, but the forger was washed out of a program in Coptic studies. I suppose at least for a time after the publication, he was absolutely delighted that he was able to dupe some very impressive scholars. Sour grapes is definitely one of the motives for the production of forgeries, modern forgeries. Professional rivalry could be as well. In the case of Coleman Norton, we probably have that being operative. Coleman Norton was someone who felt that Princeton wasn't really recognizing his own abilities to a very large degree. And it seems that part of the motivation for his production of that forgery was professional rivalry, and also, I suppose, to some degree, sort of rivalry among great schools. That is to say, he was at Princeton, he tried to publish it in Harvard's journal, he tried to publish it in Chicago's journal, ultimately failed, I'm sure, much to his chagrin, in both of those cases, but was able to succeed in getting it published in a referee journal, Catholic Biblical Quarterly. Pranks, I think that's something that people do at times. Whoever forged the Philistine Hebron inscriptions, those are the ones, remember with me, that were the Siloam Tunnel inscription words, but written backwards. That was actually something that I think was just a prank. I am certain that whoever forged that, and we don't know the name of the forger of that inscription, must have been absolutely delighted with the fact that someone as great as George Mendenhall of the University of Michigan, a very fine scholar in his own right, now the late George Mendenhall, just passed away a few years ago, I'm sure that the forger of that inscription was absolutely delighted with the fact that he was able to fool someone as great as George Mendenhall. And I think that one of the motives for the production of forgeries is, in fact, pranks at times. That's definitely the case with the Philistine Hebron inscriptions. Professional or personal aggrandizement, I think that that's one of the motives that's present as well. It's quite true that in the field of ancient texts, that if someone publishes an inscription with absolutely scintillating content that there's a great deal of attention that that scholar receives. And so that's actually a motive for the production of forgeries as well at times. And think about some of the forgeries that I've mentioned here tonight, some of the modern forgeries. Some of them are garnered an enormous amount of attention. I'm thinking, for example, the Yaakov ossuary, for example, or the ivory pomegranate, for example. Those are very famous pieces that garnered an enormous amount of positive attention at the time of publication, and certainly was, at least for a time, a cause célèbre for the scholar who published them. Religion and politics can be part of the equation as well. The Jehoash inscription, for example, whoever forged that was someone who was doing it for religious and political reasons. That is to say, that's going to be part of the equation as well at times. With the Jehoash inscription, that's the stone inscription that I suggested was sort of a kinderspiel. That's the one that I wrote to Naveh very rapidly about. It had been offered to the Israel Museum for the sum of $4 million. That inscription, the story that was given with that inscription by the dealer to the Israel Museum was that it was found in the area of the Temple Mount, and that it had basically been found there, and that it had been discarded, but someone had discovered it or found it somehow, and then it came to the hands of the owner at that time. Whoever forged that inscription was hoping to sell it for a sizable amount of money, but there was also arguably a political or religious component to that as well, or at least the forger or the dealer was hoping to play upon some of those sorts of sentiments. Obviously, economics can be part of the equation as well, and that's, I suppose, something that goes without saying. One of the things that's true, and I'll try to wrap up in a few minutes so that we'll have time for questions and answers. One of the things that I think that we can do within the field of Northwest Semitic, Hebrew Bible, and Greco-Roman texts as well, is to sort of retake the ship. One of the things that we know as a fact is that modern forgeries are produced, textual forgeries. They purport to be ancient, and sometimes they do make it into sort of the established corpus and are considered ancient, and I think that's a huge problem, and we have to be very careful about that. So here's some of the sorts of things that I think that we need to do. The first thing is that we need to recognize the methodologies that forgers use. They've traditionally relied upon actual inscriptions. They've copied the content or some of the words. We need to be aware of that. They've consistently put sensational content in these inscriptions that they've produced. They've even forged patinas, that is to say, in essence, the film or the patina that can crop up through time. And they've placed that on these forgeries that they've produced as a way of sort of duping hard scientists. Let me give you a concrete example of that. With regard to the Jehoash inscription, a modern forgery, one of the things that was done with that piece is a false patina was created. So the inscription was chiseled into stone, and then the forgers actually chemically produced, in a very or fairly accurate way, a patina that mimicked ancient patinas. The other thing that the forger did was found pieces of carbon and salted those pieces of carbon in the patina that he faked. And he also put flecks of gold in there as well, knowing full well that there would be a carbon-14 test and that these fragments of ancient carbon would be found, would be dated, and ultimately would be believed to give evidence to the authenticity of the piece. Realize, therefore, that forgers have substantial motivation in doing this very sort of thing, and they are doing it. In other words, we need to retake the ship. We need to avoid the problem of allowing modern forgeries to be declared ancient, and we need to understand the way that the forgers are working. Realize always that forgers actually commit all sorts of mistakes, and these can be ascertained as well. We sort of move along now. So we have a fair number of forgeries that have been produced, and we can discern those. We need to be very savvy about the fact, though, that the forgers are quite good at attempting to cover their tracks. In terms of the way that we approach this as the field, I think that whatever an inscription is found in excavation, that the assumption should be that it's authentic. I think that that's a fair assumption. But if something appears on the antiquities market, I think that our first instinct should be that it could very well be a modern forgery. I think, therefore, that one of the things that we should do when an inscription appears on the antiquities market, ultimately, whenever that inscription is published, it should be separated from all inscriptions from excavations. I think that we should flag any inscription that comes from the antiquities market. One can do it in a number of ways, and I've suggested a couple different ways here. That is to say, put non-prov before it to suggest that it's without provenience, or the mathematical or a mathematical sign for, in essence, 0, something along those lines. But I think that we need to mark any inscription that comes from the antiquities market. We need to separate it with something such as this. We need to separate it from the provenience inscriptions. I think we should never base any of our constructs about antiquity on an inscription for the market. We should relegate the data in an inscription for the market to a secondary status or a tertiary status. Let me give you an example of the reason for that. A number of years ago, there was a very fine article written by Michael Heltzer about the status of women in Iron Age Israel. Great article in terms of the topic, the content, the focus, but among the evidence that he used to discuss the status of women in ancient Israel was one of the Musaiaf ostraca, and it's a modern forgery. He was attempting to make arguments and to discuss women in ancient Israel, but the evidence that he was using, a primary piece of evidence that he was using, was in fact a piece, an inscription from the antiquities market, and ultimately it's a piece from the antiquities market, which is a modern forgery. Therefore, alas, in essence, everything that he said in the article is deeply problematic. So when an inscription appears on the antiquities market, I think we need to separate it from the inscriptions that come from excavations. When an inscription appears in the antiquities market, we need to flag it so that everybody knows, if they read about that inscription, that it's from the antiquities market and not from an excavation. We need to make sure that anything that we say about antiquity is based on inscriptions from excavations, not on something from the antiquities market. And the narrative or the article by Heltzer is sort of a prime reason for that sort of thing. With regard to inscriptions that appear in the antiquities market, I think that some of them are ancient, some of them are modern forgeries, and some of them are just difficult to tell with absolute certitude. And I think that we have this problem. There are inscriptions on the antiquities market that are appearing. There's probably no way to avoid that. That's going to continue to be the case. Some of them that appear are ancient. Some of them that appear on the market are absolutely not ancient. And sometimes we just can't tell. And so I think that what we need to do with any piece, any inscription that appears on the antiquities market, we need to try to categorize it to the best of our abilities. Modern forgery, probable modern forgery, possible modern forgery, probable ancient or ancient. I think that we need to categorize them. We have to be very systematic in the way that we approach this very serious problem of inscriptions on the antiquities market. I also have in mind to write an article at some point. I'm playing on tenses here, but it's an article that's entitled this, "The Future Perfect Forgery." Some grammarians among us, yes. I think that the time will come, and we're probably not too far away from it now, when in various fields, including Northwest Semitic, there is the chance that someone can produce a perfect forgery. The medium is perfect. It's an ancient medium. The ink is perfect. The script, which is usually the place where modern forgers make mistakes, the capacity is there for a modern forger to produce a perfect script. It's, in fact, much easier now than it used to be. You can use things such as Photoshop, for example, to literally trace the letters. All you have to do is copy and paste. So I think the time is coming when forgers will be able to produce inscriptions with absolutely perfect script. As well, with regard to orthography, that is to say spelling as well. The time really is now that people can produce, a forger could produce an inscription with perfect spelling. Now, fortunately, forgers make mistakes. They make mistakes with the patinas at times. So, for example, with one of the Musaifastrika, it has a fake patina on it, but the problem was with that piece that the forger was smoking a cigarette at the time that he produced the patina. And so the laboratory test that was done on that piece noted that there were modern contaminants, namely cigarette ashes, under the patina. Now, I suspect forgers will not make that mistake again. But the point is, unfortunately, they make such mistakes. With regard to the Jerusalem Papyrus, the problem there was that the forger should have written Nivlei Yayin, but instead he wrote Nevalim Yayin. I wrote in the article that I just published in the Israel Finkelstein Festschrift, the problem there is the forger didn't use the construct form. As a pun in my own article, what I said is I suspect that the modern forger of this inscription is reading up on constructs as we speak. But the time is coming, and in fact may be now, that a good modern forger can produce an absolutely perfect inscription that will pass all of the tests. So we need to be particularly vigilant about this problem. One of the things that I should say is that organizations such as the American Schools of Oriental Research, which is the major academic society for the archaeology of the ancient Middle East, or at least one of the major societies for the archaeology of the Middle East, their protocols and procedures with regard to things that come from the market and the publication or the refusal to publish those sorts of pieces. The American Schools of Oriental Research has protocols and procedures. The Society of Biblical Literature does as well. And so we're attempting to get out ahead of this problem to some degree, but to some degree it's something that we simply can't get out ahead of far enough. One of the problems right now that we have is that there have been a lot of materials pillaged from the ground coming out of Syria and Iraq. Ever since Persian Gulf I, that continues to be the case even as we speak. Sites in the Middle East, in particular in Iraq and Syria, but also heavily in Jordan and also in various other countries in the Middle East, are being pillaged, ravaged by clandestine digging. Not excavations, but clandestine, illicit digging. And so the antiquities market is literally flooded with tablets coming out of Iraq and Syria. You, in fact, may remember a case that surfaced or that came to public view just a few months ago with regard to some tablets that had been purchased by Hobby Lobby, and the Justice Department levied a $3 million fine against them, and they had to return those tablets. They're now in the custody of the U.S. government, fortunately, and ultimately, hopefully, will be returned to Iraq or Syria, wherever it has deemed that those pieces came from. But this problem continues to be a severe one. One of the fascinating things is that even out of Iraq and Syria right now, there are forged tablets that are being produced and purchased as well. So even with regard to things coming out of Iraq and Syria, there are actually some modern forgeries coming in with the stuff that's been illicitly dug. So it's a severe problem. It's been going on for a very long time, and it'll continue to be the case. So in essence, here's the point. We have inscriptions that are found on excavations. Those are legit, those are valuable, those are ancient, and that's where we should hang our hat. That's the most important epigraphic data. We also have ancient inscriptions that are being pillaged from sites and have been pillaged from sites for decades and decades and decades. It's a problem as well. And also, we have the problem of modern epigraphic forgeries. And that's something that I focused most heavily on in my own work. And the point is that some of these pieces that have garnered a great deal of attention, such as the ivory pomegranate, or the Jehoash inscription, or the Musaif ostraca, these inscriptions have garnered a great deal of attention in their modern forgeries, and that's a real problem. Things such as the Jesus Wife Papyrus, also a modern forgery. The Jerusalem Papyrus, also a modern forgery. So we have a real problem in the field with modern forgeries. Therefore, for all of you, as members of this society, remember this: when something appears in the press and it seems to be a really sensational find, the first thing that you want to ascertain is whether this find comes from a scientific archaeological expedition or whether it comes from the antiquities market. And if it comes from the antiquities market, I would suggest that the hermeneutic of suspicion is the most important thing for you to put in place, because in essence, forgers know this. Forgers know that if they can produce a fine forgery that dupes enough people and has sensational content, the market for that and the economic gain is substantial. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions. We have a procedure for questions. There are runners with microphones, and these microphones have colored foam coverings. There's a red one and a blue one and I think a green one. So please keep your hand up long enough for the runners to see you. And when you get the microphone and I call out the color of your microphone, please stand up. Tell us your name, ask, and whether you're a member or you're not, and ask a question. Save your speeches for the social hour. So, why don't we start with Tim over here and the blue microphone.
I'm Timothy Thomas. I'm a member. I have a blue microphone. It would seem that a member of an expedition would be one of the most highly motivated people to discover an inscription in their dig, because they could get funding, it would be good, they'd all become famous, and even the lowest level worker would achieve a substantial advantage from finding something. Piltdown Man wasn't found, it was found in the field. So your standard that if it's in the field, it's real, seems a little suspicious. What do you say?
Very good question. And of course, I absolutely concur with you. I think you're absolutely correct about that. What I think, there's a nice sort of illustration of this. A few years ago, or a number of years ago now, Frank Cross was the site epigrapher for the Ashkelon excavation. And someone brought to Frank Cross, one of the finest epigraphers ever in the world. He's now passed. But they brought to him an ostracan, so a piece of pottery with ink writing on it. And there was a hey, and a resh, and a vav, and a resh, and a dalet. Those were the letters there. And Frank looked at it. He was a professor at Harvard. He looked at it. It's a Harvard expedition to Ashkelon. And he said, "It says Harvard." So you're absolutely right. And in fact, I emphasize things the way that I do because I think, first and foremost, if something comes from a scientific expedition, the default position should be that this is ancient. If something comes from the market, the default position should be this may very well be a modern forgery. But I entirely agree with you that the possibility is there that someone affiliated with the excavation could salt something in the tell for the very reasons that you've indicated. So I think that that's something that I always remember. Some of you will know that the Tel Dan inscription, a very fine Aramaic inscription, I showed you a decent slide of that, found in 93 and 94 by Avraham Biran's excavation. Some people suggested that that was a modern forgery. Those of us who actually, the people who suggested that, though, were not epigraphers. They were scholars of the Hebrew Bible. One was Thomas L. Thompson, one was Fred Cryer. And they argued that that inscription arguably was a modern forgery. Ultimately, epigraphers, it was before I actually was a scholar in the field. I was still doing my doctoral work at that point. But scholars in the field who were epigraphers said, no, this is definitely ancient. But you're right. That's something that one also always has to be vigilant about.
So you have a question with the red microphone back there?
My name is Ed Fernandez. I am a member of the organization. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very insightful. Early on in your presentation, you had described the Musaf Astrakhan. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
That's good.
And you had mentioned briefly that during your dissertation, you had brought it up
Yeah.
and you used it to defend it. I'd appreciate it if you could just briefly describe your dissertation and how you used that particular piece to defend it.
All right, it's a good question. Thank you for asking that. So basically, I was in Joseph Navez's house in Jerusalem, and I'd published the laboratory report on the Musaf Ostrika, and that was in 1998. I was in Joseph Navez's home in Jerusalem in 1998, and he said, talk to me about this lab report. And I did, and he said, I don't think these pieces are good. I said, yeah, I really think the lab report suggests that they are. He said, I don't know, Chris. And I actually was just beginning my dissertation research at that point. I spent the next year and a half of my life looking only at old Hebrew inscriptions from excavations. And I looked at them, high-resolution digital images. I actually traveled here and there and looked at the actual inscriptions. But I did that. I pulled them up in Photoshop, and I drew the various strokes of the letters, measured the angles. I did that for a year and a half. Great fun in terms of literally measuring everything. The night before, and my dissertation was on the Old Hebrew script and the development during about 2 centuries of the Old Hebrew script through time. The night before I defended my dissertation, in March of '99, I thought, well, I should look at the Musaf Ostrika again because Naved said, I don't know, Chris. So I looked at him, and after spending 18 months looking only at the good stuff, I looked at those photos that I had of those, and I said to myself, oh my goodness, these are so bad. So bad. And my Dr. Fater believed that they were so good, so good. And so after I defended my dissertation, my Dr. Fater slid across the table at Gilman Hall in Johns Hopkins University. Beautiful, 30-foot oak table. We were sitting on opposite sides. Just defended. I was feeling pretty good about it. He said, tell me how these fit into your understanding of the Old Hebrew script. Remember, he thought they were authentic. I looked at him and I said, they don't. They're modern forgeries. Now, you could have heard a pin drop at that point. He said, what? I said, they're modern forgeries. Then I discussed it for a moment, and then the chairperson of the committee, who was from outside the department, that's the way Hopkins works. The chairperson of the committee is not from the department. He looks at my Dr. Fater and said, did you know he thought that? My Dr. Fater said, no, didn't know that at all. So my life flashed before my eyes briefly. But my Dr. Fater is a great person and a great scholar. And it all went well. I passed. But it was the night before I defended that I looked at those pieces. And the point is, after only looking at the good inscriptions for a year and a half and looking at them so intimately, for so long, When I saw something that was a decent modern forgery that had fooled a lot of people, including some of the most famous people in the field at that point. But I'd spent my year and a half just cutting my eye only on the good stuff, and then I immediately recognized that. And I wrote an article, a very long article about that. Now, Val liked the article very much. Cross liked the article very much. There were certain people who didn't like the article very much. But it was as a result of that article that I ended up testifying for the prosecution in the Israeli forgery trial. That was fascinating as well. One brief comment about that. I got on the stand at 9 a.m., at 9:15 a.m. for that forgery trial, got off at 10:30 p.m. that night. I was cross-examined for about 12 hours. I thought it was wonderful. Because who wants to talk about epigraphy that much, right? They wanted to talk about epigraphy all day long. I said, I got all the time in the world. I don't fly out until the morning. The DA of Jerusalem took me home that night and he said, well, this is the latest I've ever been at court. I said, me too.
Red microphone in the back there. And then we have these two questions here. You notice?
I'm Nathan Coleman. I'm not a member. First off, thank you for the talk. It was fascinating. I was particularly interested in what you said about the perfect forgery. And so my question is twofold. First off, how long in the future do you think it is where you will consistently have perfect quality forgeries that are indistinguishable? You mentioned we're already getting close. And when that happens, is that the end of the antiquities market where you don't have archaeological provenance?
It's probably the beginning. Right. I think that the nice thing is forgers usually are not as good as they think they are. And one of the things that's fascinating is that some of the blunders they make are pretty basic blunders. Like in the case of the Jerusalem Papyrus not having the construct form, that never would have happened to a native speaker of ancient Hebrew. But it would happen to a speaker of modern Hebrew because the construct forms are not used that much anymore. So the thing that I would say is forgers are probably going to make mistakes. Some forgers will always make mistakes. But the fascinating thing is forgers actually, they read our articles, they attend our meetings, and they're learning all the time. And in fact, with regard to the Samic pay thing, which I think probably seemed pretty basic to all of you, right? I mean, the fact that the Samic towered over the pay that followed it. When I first mentioned that in a presentation at ASOR or SBL, someone raised their hand and they said, they're never going to make that mistake again. I said, I know. So what I have done is actually, there are some things that I'm holding back and will never, ever talk about, just because I think it's helpful to keep some of those things back. So a couple of years ago, 2 years ago in the Navef Festschrift, I wrote an article about the Ma'arana seal. It's the one that's on the half-shekel, modern half-shekel coin in Israel. That piece is a modern forgery. And the Israel Museum brought me in. They were like, hey, do you want to look at this? And I said, sure. And I looked at it, and when I looked at it under the microscope, and I've looked at a lot of seals microscopically, that one was manufactured in a way that's entirely different from the way all ancient seals that I've ever looked at are done. And in my article condemning that piece as a modern forgery, I just mentioned that there were problems with the technique of manufacture, and I didn't say any more about that, nor will I. So, but I think that, yeah, we're on the verge of people being able to produce a perfect modern forgery. People often, I think people are actually working. People who know the script and the language are working with people who know hard sciences, and they're able to do quite good work. And I hope that we stay ahead of them. But I think we can't forever.
Al, if you'll get the microphone from James there. I believe you had a question.
Yeah, I had...
Who are you?
Oh, my name is Al Ehrlich, and I am a member. I had two questions. You mentioned the pieces that may be a forgery, probably a forgery. How are they priced on a scale between a well-thought-of piece and a pure forgery? I mean, how do they price those, the value of those?
Well, the market drives such things, literally. In other words, The Musaev ostraca, those sold for 125 grand a piece because they were considered nice, but they were on potsherds. And so Shlomo Musaev was willing to pay 125,000 a piece for them. They're modern forgeries, so some forger made a great deal of money on those, or some dealer made a great deal of money on those. The ivory pomegranate, which people thought was from the first temple, 550,000 for that. So the Jehoash inscription, if Joseph Naveh would have said about the Jehoash inscription, that stone inscription, which is really a bad forgery, and Naveh immediately recognized it. If he would have said this is good, the Israel Museum would have paid $4 million for it. There's no doubt about that. So the more sensational the find, and the greater the putative place of origin, the temple itself, the higher the price. But ultimately, like everything else, it depends on how much someone is willing to pay.
Just quickie, what are there? You mentioned very little about criminal penalties for forgers. Are there?
It's difficult to actually prove that someone is a forger. It's not so hard to discern that something is a modern forgery, but this is a world of cloak and dagger and smoke and mirrors. And attempting to peel things back to the point that one can actually know and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone has done something, that's really difficult to do. So for example, in the Israeli forgery trial, the people who were charged were largely acquitted or charged with minor offenses, including for things like the Jehoash inscription, which is such a bad forgery. But they found, the defense found some people who don't do epigraphy, as well as one or two who putatively do a little epigraphy, to declare them to be genuine, and that's, of course, all that was needed for the declaration, ultimately, of innocence for those charged. So it's really hard. Even in the case of Ariel Sabar and the Jesus Wife Papyrus, he named the person he thought forged it, pretty sure. And that, by the way, is the thing that convinced Karen King that it was a forgery. When she read Ariel Sabar's article in The Atlantic and all of the investigative reporting that he'd done, and she realized that she had believed the story that the dealer had given her, the owner had given her. When she read Ariel Sabar's article, even she conceded that it was a modern forgery and she'd been duped. But even in that case, proving that that guy whom Ariel names is the forger is still kind of difficult, because all he has to do is deny it and come find a few people who say, I think it could be ancient. Alas. Yep, you're welcome.
Red microphone.
My name is Terry Layton. I'm a member. You just partially answered my question, but I had one more. If you can prove who the forger is it a crime only if they sell the item and make money off it, or is it a crime simply to deface the genuine antique, even if they don't make money off it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and some of you would be in this room would be in a better position than I to discuss the legality of that sort of thing. Eric may very well know it. I don't know that it's a crime to deface an object that appears because there is a legal antiquities market, for example. There is a legal antiquities market in various countries, and to some degree, even in this country. In Israel, there's a legal antiquities market as well. So if you buy it, you can do anything with it you want to, I suppose. So it's not actually considered defacing. So if you want to buy an ashori and write your name in it, you could certainly do that, and it's not illegal. But if you sell it, then, of course, this is a problem because this is not a legitimate sale.
David, red microphone.
David Rosen, lifetime member. Question: is there a problem with natural redeposits, like somebody else took it or it got washed and put in the wrong strata or something? And what would you say to those forgers, those ambitious forgers in here who may be lurking?
Yeah. think, so if I understand your question correctly, so what about a piece that's a legitimate ancient piece, but it just sort of ends up in the wrong stratum? Is that what you mean? Yeah, it happens all the time. In fact, most of the time when an inscription is found, it's not actually in a clear locus, for example. But, you know, it's not too hard to determine that a piece is actually ancient. So, sure, I mean, pieces are often found because of the law of superposition, you know, all sorts of things, erosion, an ancient pit that was dug and something ends up in the wrong stratum, as it were, or seems to end up in the wrong stratum. That happens all the time, and that's sort of the context that we have for a lot of the genuine inscriptions that are found. But that can be ascertained if there's a good scientific expedition. You can actually figure that stuff out quite nicely. And then when you look at the piece, it's usually quite obvious that it's a legitimate piece. Well, any would-be forgers, don't do it. So it's not worth it. Crime doesn't pay. So.
You have a question, Gretchen? Blue microphone.
Hi, my name's Gretchen. I'm a guest. I have to stand up. Okay. Can you characterize any of these forgers? Does it run in families, and has this been going for a while? Are they failed scholars that have gone rogue? Are they? Do you know some of them? Do you suspect? Yeah. Do you suspect that there's some of them? I mean, I've spent time in the Middle East, and very often antiquities dealers that are quite legitimate know who the forgers are, and they know who these people are that come to try to sell things to them.
Sure. Yeah. So what I would say is antiquities dealers sometimes know, sometimes they don't know. They always purport to know. And so my general modus operandi is never to believe anyone who says anything. So the old line that I don't believe anything I hear and only half of what I see. So, right, sure, there are people that are suspected of being forgers, and sure, I have a short list in my mind, but I'll never discuss such things because that would be considered libelous, and so I just can't do that sort of thing. Antiquities dealers always purport to know a great deal about these sorts of things, but when I walk through the streets of Jerusalem, if I walk by a shop and I sort of see something, if I walk in there, the dealer will actually say to me, once he figures out that I know some things about the script and the language, he'll actually say to me, what do you think about this? So dealers often posture in such a fashion that they seem to know some things, and some dealers certainly know some things, but yeah, they're not quite as good as they might seem to suggest.
Jay? Oh, wait. You'll be after Dale. Dale?
Oh, sorry.
No, don't stand up. You can sit.
I have a different approach.
You're Dale Doucette, and you're a member.
Mine's Dale Doucette. I'm a member. Having worked in Egypt for a number of years, I became aware that not forgery, but copies have great value. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, I brought some back. Mm-hmm. And they're beautiful things.
They are.
So my question to you is, copies do not they have value? Actually, some forgeries should have values because they did such a good job, you could discuss it in the museum.
I absolutely agree with you for sure. So with regard to the second point in particular, it reminds me to say this. First of all, with regard to the subject of replicas or something such as this, copies, if they're sold as copies. So I have a really nice Gezer tablet in my office that's a really nice replica. I like it very much. Now, if I sold that as authentic, then that would be a problem. But copies, replicas, these things are all very nice, and I think there's a place for those for sure. Now, so that's definitely the case. With regard to your your second point, I absolutely agree as well. I think that what museums absolutely ought to do, and I've said this in print more than a decade ago, is have exhibits of forgeries to draw the public's attention to the fact that this is a phenomenon that absolutely occurs. To the credit of the Israel Museum, a decade and a half ago, they actually had an exhibit which was solely the Shapira forgeries. Solely the Shapira forgeries. I applaud them for that. I think that was a really good thing to do. I think the Smithsonian should do the same thing. I think that there is great reason for doing that. And I wish that museums broadly would actually start that. The Bible Museum, not too far from here, of course, has garnered a great deal of attention from all sorts of places. One can say what one wants to about it, and I've been critical of them for certain things and been grateful to them for actually being honest about certain things and for correcting their ways. One of the things that they actually do, if you go there, they actually have some Dead Sea Scroll fragments, like really small fragments, nothing like you'd see at the Shrine of the Book or the Citadel Museum in Amman, the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, or the Citadel Museum in Amman. The Museum of the Bible has some really small fragments. To their credit, especially because of pressure from various people, they actually have signage that says these may be modern forgeries. I think that's something I'm glad they state. So,
Jay, with the blue microphone.
My name is Jay Kaplan. I have been fascinated for decades with the forgeries by von Meegeren of Vermeer. At the time, experts were concluded easily that these were genuine Vermeers.
Yep.
We look at them today, 60, 70 years later,
Yep.
and find it mind-boggling that experts could have determined that those were actual Vermeers.
Yep.
Doesn't the same thing apply with forgeries of antiquities? That something today would look authentic, but 50 years from now, someone's going to look at that and say, well, how could that scholar from George Washington University conceivably have said that this was authentic?
No, it's a great point, and I entirely agree with you. So, and in fact, within the history of the field, we have sort of demonstration of that, with Schlattmann arguing that the Shapira pottery was genuine. He argued that, and he argued it in ZDPV ad nauseum, hundreds of pages, arguing that the Shapira pottery was authentic and ancient, and he was trying to decipher it and was coming up with some words, and he reprimanded people who argued that they were forgeries, including Claremont Ganneau, and denigrated them. If I showed them, and I have, to a beginning graduate student in epigraphy, he or she would say immediately, this is a horrible forgery. And yet, Schlattmann was a great scholar of the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and he genuinely thought to his grave that they were good. And that's instructive, and it's concerning as well. Fortunately, there were people in his own day who ultimately said, no, these are forgeries, and they're really bad ones. But you're right. That's why, like in my case, I say anything from the antiquities market has to be separated out. Don't mix it in with the rest of the corpus, because once it gets mixed in, like if I think something's genuine and 40 years from now it's proven to be a forgery, that's why I actually don't discuss pieces that I think are ancient. I actually just publish on the forgeries normally. But in any case, let's say that I thought something was ancient and 40 years from now it's discovered or discerned that it's actually modern forgery. I'd be grateful for that. I won't be around to see it. But it's the very reason why I think we need to separate these pieces out. If something's from the market, flag it with some sort of symbol signifying the fact that it's from the market, publish it in the second half of a volume on inscriptions, not the first half, entirely separate these things for this very reason, the very reason that you raise. Because we have to keep the data set as pure as possible, and the only way to do that is to separate things from excavations from things that are found or that appear on the antiquities market. Yep. Thank you. Great question.
Bruce, I think the last question there.
Yeah, Bruce Murray, I'm a member. Has anyone, a legitimate scholar, ever tried to create forgeries themselves and distribute them in the markets to study the flow and how accurately the dealers can evaluate these things and what happens?
It's tempting, and not very tempting, mind you. A few years ago, some of you know Herschel Shanks, who's a friend. He's one of my best frenemies. So no, we are good friends, and often when I've come to the Cosmos Club, it's with him. He's a good friend. But he made an offer in the pages of Bar a few years ago, and he offered $5,000 to a scholar who would produce a forgery. And he actually sent one to me, and he was like, "What? Someone actually." He just sent me an email once. He had an attachment of a photograph, and he said, "Look, this inscription's been found. It appeared in the antiquities market. What do you think?" And I said, "This is a horrible modern forgery." Then he wrote me back, and he was like, "It was a 5th grade class project, and you've just really hurt the kids' feelings." I'm so sorry about that. But, you know, it is a modern forgery. But then he said to me, he said, "I'm offering $5,000. Why aren't scholars taking me up on this?" I said, "Really, Herschel, $5,000? So that's crazy. I mean, who's going to do it for $5,000? I said, if you really want people to take you up on your offer, you want scholars to take you up, offer $100 grand, then you might get someone who'd actually work to produce a forgery. Of course, it would be something that would be stated to be such, but when published, but it's going to, you know, scholars not going to, trifle or sandbox in such a fashion for such a small amount. Now, Herschel said that he didn't really understand my logic, but please, I mean, producing such a thing takes a lot of time. You need a really good epigrapher. You need a really sharp chisel or a really nice reed pen. You got to create a patina, so you got to bring in a hard science person. Maybe you want to salt some flexive gold in there. This costs money as well. You got to fly to the Middle East, get some nice carbonized remains that you can salt in your patina. So these things take money. So I just said, look, $5,000, please. It's not worth it.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Very good.
So before you go, I want to present you with a token of thanks, a framed copy of the announcement of your talk signed by all the members of the General Committee on behalf of the membership, and a copy of Bulletin of the Philosophical Society of Washington, Volume 1, which is very important because it has reasons for the name and what the society was supposed to be about, and a list of all the original founders, as well as minutes of some of the early meetings.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for that.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sit down for a minute. And before we go, we have some housekeeping items. First and foremost, thank you to all of our members, sponsors, supporters. PSW depends on an enthusiastic, active, and capable membership, and the supporters and sponsors who put the bill for these otherwise free lectures. And without all of you, PSW would not be able to continue and would not grow. So please join if you're a member. You can apply for membership on our website. It's really very easy, believe it or not, although many people seem to have problems with it. I just go to the membership button, and that will pull up the application for membership. It's kind of logical, right? Membership button, application. You fill out the application, and when you get down to the bottom, you get to the payment button. Yes, we require payment, but if you are turned down for membership, we'll return your dues, but it's very unlikely. So when you push this button, you will pull up a screen, which I can't show you because I didn't want to have to pay. But believe me, you can pay with a regular credit card. You do not have to use PayPal. It's a standard web form that should be easy to use. If you have any problems, you can contact our corresponding secretary, and she will step you through the process, and she won't charge you any extra money for it either. So we strongly encourage everyone who's not yet a PSW member to join. If you have any questions, please see corresponding Secretary Robin Taylor standing in the back there in the red jersey and waving. And she has a name tag too, so pretty hard to miss her. If you are a member and you haven't paid your dues, please do so forthwith in order not to be purged from the record. Keep in mind that PSW is a nonprofit educational organization. It's tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Contributions are kind of tax deductible in view of the recent changes in tax law, but they are still eligible for deduction. Our next lecture, not that one, it's this one. Our next lecture and the 2389th meeting will take place on March 9th, 2018, right here in the Powell Auditorium. The speaker will be Thomas Zurbuchen, who is the Associate Administrator for Science, for the Science Mission Directorate at NASA. And he'll be speaking on eclipses, using shadows to shed new light. The lecture is sponsored by Gene Shaw in honor of Karen Shaner. I think Karen's around somewhere, so. Please note this is kind of a change in schedule, and we're rescheduling the second lecture of February, hopefully to the beginning of June. The spring schedule as of now is shown in this slide. So after Zurbuchen, we have Andy Knoll of Harvard to speak about life on Earth. He'll be talking about the earliest detectable signs of life in the fossil record. And then on April 6th, we have Jordi Soiree from Cal Polytech, and he's going to be speaking about CubeSats, which he is the co-inventor, and seems to be very busy running around talking a lot about CubeSats everywhere in the world. I'm sure many of you watched the rather spectacular launch of the Falcon Heavy and the even more spectacular landing of the two side boosters. And this is a gigantic rocket, although not as big as the BFR, which is supposed to follow on. But there's a funny opposite trend in the market to make things smaller. And so I don't know how many thousands of CubeSats they'll be able to launch on the Falcon Heavy, but it's going to be able to launch a lot of CubeSats. And then we have two dates that I will be filling, and by the next time we meet, you'll know who those speakers are. I just have a wealth of choices, and we haven't quite sorted it all out. And on May 18th, we're going to have a Cassini special series of lectures with 5 or 6 of the key people who worked on Cassini to talk about Cassini's travels to Saturn and what it found in the Saturn system. They'll talk about Saturn itself. They'll talk about Cassini itself. They'll talk about Huygens and its trip down to one of Saturn's moons. And they'll talk about the rings, and they'll talk about the 35 moons that Saturn has, probably more than that. And with that, I should mention that the social hour ends at 10:30, so we should hurry up and adjourn. After the social hour, some of us go across the street to the Fairfax Hotel Lounge to continue talking and to have more drinks. And if you would like to join us, I think we'll go tonight. Can't be sure, but corresponding Secretary Robin Taylor is back there, and you can ask her about it. When you leave, please use the side entrance. And I will now accept a motion from a member to adjourn to the social hour. Okay, I got a motion. Do I have a second? I have many seconds. All in favor? All opposed? Meeting is adjourned to the social hour. Eric.